There are moments in every man's life when all his accomplishments, all his power, all the respect he commands in the world, disappears with a single look from his mother. For Al Capone, that moment came on a humid August afternoon in 1925 in his office above the Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero, Illinois. He was 36 years old. He controlled an empire worth millions. Politicians sought his favor. Enemies feared his name. And then his 70-year-old mother walked through his door, looked around at the mahogany desk, the expensive suits, the men who jumped when he spoke, and saw only her disappointing son. What happened in the next 3 minutes didn't just humble the most powerful man in Chicago. It reminded him of something he'd forgotten in all his success, that some authority runs deeper than fear, older than money, and stronger than any empire built on the streets. This is a story about the day Al Capone learned that you can conquer a city, but you never outgrow your mother's disappointment. August 17, 1925. The Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero was buzzing with the kind of controlled energy that marked Al Capone's headquarters. Men in expensive suits moved through the lobbies and corridors with purpose. Phones rang constantly. Money changed hands in quiet conversations. Al's office on the 3rd floor was the center of it all. That afternoon, he was meeting with his lieutenants, Johnny Torrio, Frank Nitti, Jake Guzik. They were discussing territory, shipments, the delicate politics of running an organization that employed thousands and generated millions. The men around that table represented decades of street wisdom. They had seen everything, feared little, commanded respect through reputation and results. This was the inner circle of the most powerful criminal organization in America. And then came the knock on the door that changed everything. Al's secretary, a nervous young man named Eddie, cracked the door open just wide enough to whisper urgently, "Mr. Capone, there's a lady here to see you." Al barely looked up from the papers spread across his desk. "Tell her to make an appointment." "Sir," Eddie's voice cracked slightly. "She says she's your mother." The room went silent. Not the respectful quiet that came when Al was thinking, but the absolute stillness that comes when something unexpected and dangerous enters the space. Al looked up, his face showing the first flicker of something his men had never seen before, uncertainty. "My mother." "Yes, sir. She's quite insistent, sir." Johnny Torrio, who had known Al longer than anyone, caught his eye and raised an eyebrow. Al's family didn't come to the office, ever. That was one of his rules. Business stayed separate from family. Al stood up slowly, adjusting his tie. "Tell the boys in the lobby tell them to be respectful." "And Eddie?" "Yes, sir. Show her up." Teresa Capone was not a woman who made casual visits. At 70, she remained exactly what she had always been, the undisputed authority in the Capone household. Born in Italy, married at 16, mother of 9 children, she had crossed an ocean and survived decades of poverty in Brooklyn with her dignity intact and her moral compass unwavering. She was small in stature, barely 5 feet tall, but she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had never doubted her own judgment. Her gray hair was pulled back in the same simple style she'd worn for 40 years. Her black dress was modest, proper, spotless. Teresa spoke little English, but she understood everything. She watched everything, and she forgot nothing. Alsher's rise to power had been a source of both pride and profound worry for her. Pride because her son had lifted the family from poverty to prosperity. Worry because she knew with the intuition that comes from loving someone completely that the money came with a price that would eventually be too high to pay. She had stayed away from his business as he had asked. She had accepted the house he bought for her, the monthly envelope of money, the protection he provided, but she had also continued to light candles for his soul every Sunday at church, and to pray for guidance about when to speak and when to remain silent. That morning, reading the newspaper at her kitchen table, she had decided that the time for silence was over. The headline read, "Capone Gang War Claims 3 More." Below it was a photograph of her son walking out of a courthouse with a smile that looked more like a sneer. Teresa had folded the newspaper carefully, put on her hat, and taken the streetcar to Cicero. When the door to Al's office opened and Teresa Capone walked in, everything changed. Not just the energy in the room, but something fundamental about who was in charge. Al stood immediately, his men following suit out of ingrained respect for age and womanhood. But Teresa's eyes swept past the expensive furniture, the crystal decanters, the respectful nods from men in $1,000 suits. She saw the newspaper clipping pinned to a bulletin board behind Al's desk, another headline about his acquittal. She saw the photograph on his desk of himself shaking hands with a politician. She saw the ledger books that recorded profits from businesses she preferred not to think about too closely. And then she looked at her son. "Alfonso," she said quietly. Her voice carried the weight of disappointment that only a mother can bring to a single name. "Mama," Al said, moving around his desk toward her. "What are you doing here? Is everything all right?" She held up one small hand, stopping him in his tracks. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out that morning's newspaper. She unfolded it slowly, deliberately, holding it so he could see the headline. "Is this all right, Alfonso?" The men around the table suddenly found the ceiling, the floor, anywhere but the scene unfolding in front of them extremely interesting. They had seen Al face down federal agents, rival gangsters, corrupt politicians. They had never seen him face his mother's disappointment. Al glanced at the newspaper, then back at his mother's face. "Mama, that's just newspaper talk. You know they exaggerate everything. 3 men are dead, Alfonso. Mama, you don't understand how business works here. Sometimes there are conflicts. I understand." Her voice was still quiet, but it carried a finality that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. "I understand that I raised my son to be a man of honor, a man who protects his family, who works hard, who respects the law of God and the law of man." She folded the newspaper and set it on his desk, right on top of the papers he'd been studying. "I understand that the man in this picture, the man who smiles when other men die, is not the son I raised." Al looked around his office, suddenly seeing it through his mother's eyes. The luxury that represented success to him looked different when filtered through the values she had taught him in a tenement kitchen in Brooklyn. "Mama," he said, his voice softer now, "I've given you everything. The house, the security, the money, so you never have to worry about anything. I've taken care of the family." Teresa studied his face for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was thick with the accent that 40 years in America had never quite erased. "You think this is taking care of family, this violence, this shame in the newspapers? You think money cleans the blood off your hands? I've never." Al started to protest. "Don't lie to your mother, Alfonso. Not now. Not about this." The silence that followed was deafening. Al Capone, the man who commanded absolute obedience from hundreds of men, stood in his own office, unable to meet his mother's gaze. Finally, Teresa spoke again. "Your father and I, we came to America with nothing but the hope that our children would be better than we were, that they would have chances we never had, that they would build something good, something honest, something to be proud of." She paused, looking around the room one more time. "This is not what we dreamed for you." And then, with a speed that surprised everyone in the room, Teresa Capone stepped forward and slapped her son across the face, not hard enough to hurt him physically, but with enough force to echo through the room like a gunshot. The sound seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. Al's head snapped back slightly, more from shock than from the impact. His hand moved instinctively toward his cheek, then stopped. Around the table, his men stared at their shoes, their hands, anywhere but at their boss being disciplined like a child. "That," Teresa said, her voice steady and clear, "is for forgetting who you are, for forgetting where you come from, for thinking that money and fear make you a man." For a moment, that felt like hours, nobody moved. Al stood with his hand halfway to his cheek, his face red, not from the slap, but from embarrassment. His mother stood before him, all 5 feet of her, waiting to see what the man she had raised would do next. Finally, Al lowered his hand. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the authority that usually filled that room. "Mama, and you will decide if the man you have become is the man you want to be." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked toward the door. Al followed, his head down like a boy who had been caught stealing apples. The elevator ride to the lobby was silent. The men downstairs, sensing something had changed, parted respectfully as Teresa Capone walked through their midst toward the exit. Al walked beside her, no longer the commanding figure who had entered the building that morning, but something smaller and more uncertain. At the door, Teresa stopped and looked up at her son one more time. "I will pray for you, Alfonso. I will pray that you remember the difference between respect that comes from fear and respect that comes from honor. And I will pray that it is not too late for you to choose." She kissed his cheek, the same cheek she had slapped, and walked out into the Chicago afternoon. Al stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her disappear into the crowd of pedestrians on the sidewalk. When he finally turned around, his men were careful not to make eye contact. The most powerful man in Chicago had just been reduced to a chastened child by a 70-year-old woman, and everyone had witnessed it. Word of what happened in Al Capone's office that day spread through his organization like wildfire, but not in the way anyone might have expected. Instead of undermining his authority, the incident somehow strengthened it. The men who worked for Al saw something that day that they had never seen before, that their boss, despite all his power, still answered to something higher than himself, still respected something deeper than fear. Johnny Torrio, walking back into the office after Teresa left, found Al sitting at his desk, staring at the newspaper his mother had left there. "Boss," Johnny said quietly. Al looked up, and Torrio saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there an hour earlier. Not weakness, but consideration. The look of a man questioning things he had taken for granted. "She's right, you know," Al said finally, "about what we've become, about what I've become." He picked up the newspaper, studied the headline again. "3 men dead, and I'm smiling in the picture like I won a prize." Torrio sat down across from him. "This business, Al, it's not a Sunday school, you know that." "I know, but there's a difference between doing what you have to do and enjoying it. There's a difference between protecting what's yours and hunting for trouble." That evening, Al did something he hadn't done in years. He went to his mother's house for dinner. Not to bring money or gifts, but to sit at her kitchen table and eat the simple meal she prepared and listen to her talk about the neighbors, the weather, the small concerns of ordinary life. And when she served him the pasta e fagioli he had loved as a child, he tasted something in it that all the expensive restaurants in Chicago couldn't provide: the flavor of home, of family, of who he had been before the money and the power and the fear. The incident with his mother didn't change Al Capone overnight. He remained who he was, did what he felt he had to do, continued to navigate the dangerous world he had created for himself. But something fundamental shifted that day, a perspective that had been lost in years of success and violence, a reminder that power without principle is just another form of weakness. In his later years, especially during his time in prison and in the quiet decline of his final days in Miami, Al would often speak about that afternoon. Not with bitterness, but with something approaching gratitude. His wife May once asked him about it during one of his clearer moments near the end. "Why did she do it, Al? In front of all those men?" Al thought about it for a long time before answering. "Because she knew I would listen. Because she knew that sometimes a man needs to be reminded who he really is, and sometimes the only person who can do that is the one who loved him before he became anything else." He paused, staring out the window at the Florida sunshine, and because she knew that if she did it in private, I could pretend it didn't matter. But in front of those men, in front of witnesses, I couldn't pretend it away. I had to face it. Face what? That my mother was disappointed in me, that the woman who gave me life thought I was wasting it. He shook his head. "There's no armor against that, no power that protects you from that kind of truth." The story of Al Capone and his mother's slap is more than just a moment of family drama played out in a criminal empire. It's a reminder of something we all carry with us, regardless of what we achieve or how far we rise. The voice of those who loved us first, who knew us before we became whatever the world turned us into. That voice, whether it belongs to a mother, a father, a grandparent, or anyone who saw our potential when we were young, never really goes away. It speaks to us in quiet moments, reminding us of values we might have forgotten, principles we might have compromised, dreams we might have abandoned for more practical pursuits. Teresa Capone's slap wasn't just about crime or violence or the specific choices her son had made. It was about the universal tension between who we become and who we were meant to be, between the compromises we make to survive in the world and the truths that survive in our hearts. Every successful person faces this reckoning eventually, the moment when they must look back and ask, in gaining everything I wanted, what did I lose of who I was? For Al Capone, that moment came with the sting of his mother's hand and the weight of her disappointment. It came with the realization that all the respect he commanded meant nothing if he had lost the respect of the person whose opinion mattered most. She outlived her famous son by several years, spending her final days in the same simple dignity with which she had lived her entire life. When reporters came to ask her about Al, about his empire and his crimes and his legacy, she would always say the same thing: he was my son. Before he was anything else to anyone else, he was my son, and I loved him for who he could have been, not for what he became. That's the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything except that we remember who we really are. And that's the kind of wisdom that comes not from books or experience or success, but from the people who see us clearly and love us anyway. Sometimes it takes a slap to wake us up. Sometimes it takes a mother's disappointment to remind us that no achievement is worth losing ourselves. And sometimes it takes looking back at who we were to understand who we're meant to be. That's a lesson worth remembering, no matter how high we rise or how far we fall, because in the end we all answer to someone. And if we're lucky, that someone loves us enough to tell us the truth.